Thanks. Thanks, Soren. Hi,
Great.
everyone. Yeah, it's a small world. And can you see oh, I just turned off my thing, but can you see my slides okay? Yeah, it's good
I
like
can,
that.
yes.
Yeah. No, it's a small world, and Soren's kind of my hero because he stayed true to the cause of being a true biologist, a field biologist. And you'll see in this talk that I must have done something horrible in a past life because I spent a lot of time working on the UN Convention on Biodiversity. I'm joking a bit, but actually, as I explain the process and what it all means, I think it's really important, but it is a bit like watching paint dry at times. So what I wanted to do tonight was talk a little bit about what the world is trying to do to address the sixth extinction crisis, what we've tried to do in the past and how we failed, and what we maybe need to do to set ourselves up for success over the next 30 years. And I chose this slide actually because this is a slide from somebody, and actually the title of this talk comes from quite an amazing person. Her name was Georgina Mace, and she was a professor of biodiversity at the Imperial College in London. We also lost her. She was a real giant in the biodiversity world. And she really led a lot of the thinking around how you can take a scientific approach and make it feasible at the global scale for restoring and recovering biodiversity. And so this infographic here on the screen comes from the concepts that she developed, where it's a little bit like climate change, where you're coming up with different scenarios, business as usual, some level of mitigation or full-on transformative change, and what that might mean in this case for nature. So as mentioned, Soren had become aware of this article that came out in the Globe in January, and what happened here was some colleagues of mine around the world sort of looked at what's going on right now in terms of the framing of the post 2020 global biodiversity framework, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that is, and pointing out some of the shortcomings in it. And they asked me to be an external peer reviewer of that report, and so I happily obliged, and that led to this article, which I was interviewed for. So I'll talk a little bit about the following things, and hopefully this will be clear why I'm talking about indirect and direct drivers of biodiversity loss at the global scale. I'll talk a little bit about the UN conventions and the processes that are under the hood of these conventions. And that's actually quite important to understand, because people, of course, get very frustrated with the UN and UN processes, but hopefully I'll explain to you why it's such a slow-moving and painful beast. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the analysis that I've done and that my team has done. So we've really been looking back at the past decade to see why we keep failing at the global scale and at the national scale around the world to meet the targets that we set for biodiversity. And then based on that, what do we need to do differently? So with the post-2020 global biodiversity framework currently in negotiation, how can we actually learn from our failures and set ourselves up for success? And so I'll end with that. But I hope that we can talk about this. I hope there's time for this, because I actually quite honestly would appreciate your feedback, because I struggle a lot with the work that I do, especially within these UN conventions. Sometimes I sort of throw my hands up in despair and feel like I'm wasting my time. And then other times I think, well, it's the only game in town and we got to engage in it. But, sometimes when you get really stuck into something, you sort of stop seeing the forest for the trees. So I'd love any reflections that you guys have on what I'm talking about here. So we'll just start with the elephant in the room, and this is no surprise to anybody. So this is, how the world's human population exploded over the last 12,000 years, and how, well, really it's exploded over the last century or the last 150 years. And it's not the elephant in the room amongst any of us to talk about this, but nobody wants to talk about it when we talk about things like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change or the UN Convention on Biodiversity. And the reason is that it's incredibly political hot potato. This is a multilateral process with a couple hundred countries, some with really high growth rates. And the process is very careful to not talk about these things, but in doing so, we kind of lose track of what really is driving all of our environmental crises. And it's the matter of just having way too many people on this planet, and those people consuming way too much stuff. So following in check with global human population rises is GDP. So our consumption patterns are exponential, and it shouldn't be any surprise on a finite planet that if you do that, you're going to see some massive changes in how the Earth operates. And that's what we're seeing. And we actually call that, of course, the age of the Anthropocene. Sort of, it's the new geological epoch where humans now operate at a scale that we're actually able to affect and drive the biological, chemical, and geological processes on our planet at scale. And this is actually a night shot composite from the US Department of Defense satellites. So they have some missile defense satellites that look for rocket flares and things like that, but you can use it for other stuff such as footprint. So this is just an interesting way to show a proxy for the human footprint on the planet. And when you think about how many species are on the planet, and no one knows, of course, the latest guess that I read was 8.7 million, but that's probably totally wrong. But our one species, humans, we take up about 50% of what we call the Earth's biocapacity on an annual basis. So everything that the Earth produces in terms of energy and biomass and production, we take half and we give the other half to the other 8.699 million species. So you can't do that without seeing some massive changes in the system. And so when we sort of get down from the issue of the core issue, which is human population and human consumption patterns, this is where actually UN processes tend to focus their attention. And for biodiversity, we call those indirect and direct drivers. And this comes out of a global assessment process called IPBES, or the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's akin to IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a scientific body that comes together and continually assesses issues around climate change. Well, we have IPBES for biodiversity. And IPBES has tried to break down in a more coherent way what's behind the biodiversity crisis. Not just there's too many people consuming too many stuff, but how does that actually play out? And so we talk about indirect drivers such as demographic and sociocultural drivers, economic and technological. So economic could be, the fact that we mostly subscribe to a growth model. Institutions and governance, so how we actually govern and make decisions that may affect biodiversity. And then conflicts and epidemics as part of that. And those sort of play out in different ways and in cumulative ways to derive into things like massive changes in land and sea use, overexploitation of species, both legal and illegal, of course, climate change and pollution, and invasive alien species. And this is happening across the world, and at such a pace that we see the Earth as a living system start to change. So it's billions of little tiny cuts every day that we're all making, which adds up to a changing chemistry of our atmosphere, massive land use change, increased epidemic risk from zoonotic diseases and so forth. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that with, natural ecosystems declining on average of 47%. About a quarter of the species are already threatened with extinction, and we expect to see, if we don't change, about 1 million species go extinct in the next 50 years. all on and on it goes. I don't need to get into this in detail because, of course, you all know this stuff. So now we get into the global agreements and the road to 2050. And hopefully I'll make it clear why I just talked about indirect and direct drivers, because for the new post-2020 framework, that's really how it's structured around those particular issues. So there's lots of global environmental agreements. The term that's usually used is multilateral environmental agreements. And so there's things like the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, there's the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, there's the Convention on Migratory Species, there's the UN Convention on Combating Desertification, there's the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, and there's, of course, the most famous one, the UN Convention on Climate Change. And then this isn't a convention, but the 2030 Human Development Agenda, or the Sustainable Development Goals, is in a way kind of operates like a convention, in that it has a set of goals and targets that parties to these agreements sign up to. And that's what's common to all these agreements, is if you sign and ratify as a government onto these agreements, you're then somewhat on the hook for some commitments that are under those agreements. But I'll talk a little bit about that. And biodiversity, we always like to remind everyone, sort of underpins everything. You can't have an economy, you can't have culture, you can't have society without a functioning and healthy biosphere. And this is really the case with the Sustainable Development Goals. Most of them are not considered biological goals, but you can't actually reach those goals without meeting what we call SDG goals 14 and 15, which is goals for oceans and goals for land. So, okay, so I'm going to get into the boring stuff, but and this is why I sometimes wonder what I'm doing. So just some of what happens is with these multilateral environmental agreements, a lot of them, but not all of them, came out of the 1992 Rio Earth Summit. So the Rio Earth Summit was kind of the inflection point, because there was years and years of work before the Rio Earth Summit to set up the biodiversity and climate conventions, for instance. But at that summit, that's when governments were invited to sign on to these agreements. And all these agreements attempt to create a global coordinated response to particular environmental issues. And they're consensus-based, which is challenging. So the way it works is that the ministers at the end of the day that are responsible for an agreement sign on. So they'll sign on to a particular agreement. But before that, there's a series of technical and scientific and other process-oriented meetings which negotiate recommendations that go to the ministers for decisions. And so I largely spend my time as a member of the subsidiary body on scientific and technical advice. It's called SBSTA. And there's a SBSTA for the Biodiversity Convention. There's a SBSTA for the Climate Convention. It's a typical UN body. And I am not representing a government, but I do represent an intergovernmental organization, so a global network. So I have a microphone and I'm allowed to speak. But because I'm not a government, whenever I make an intervention, I need to get some of the parties to the agreement, which are the governments, to agree with what I just said. So whenever I'm about to say something, that's something that I've spent at least 3 weeks working behind the scenes to get other governments, other countries to agree with me on that, because it's pointless to say something in these processes without governments getting behind them. And so the way it works in these agreements is that whenever you meet, so SBSTA meetings for the Biodiversity Convention are usually in Montreal, because that's where the secretariat to the Convention on Biological Diversity is. But the next one's actually in March, and it's going to be in Geneva. And what happens is that an agenda is set, and for each agenda item, there's something called a conference paper that's introduced. And that's just basically a draft agreement. So they might have a conference paper on things like digital sequencing of genetic resources or marine protected areas. And they'll introduce that in the plenary. So we're all in the room together. And then almost always somebody doesn't agree with the text. In fact, it's almost guaranteed. You never, nobody ever just says, yeah, that's great. So what happens is that we go through hours and hours, sometimes days of rounds. And for the Biodiversity Convention, there's 196 parties to that convention. So there's a lot of people in line to talk. And we try and find out where the disagreement is. And when there's not agreement on particular issues, they strike what they call a contact group. And that's just a fancy word for you're going to go in a room and you're going to work through the night arguing and trying to get agreement. That's basically what happens. And so we try and resolve those issues around particular sentences of the draft recommendation in those rooms. And where there isn't agreement, then you bracket that text. So there'll be text that's bracketed. And lately, the real challenge has been Brazil. So Brazil used to be really great. And sometimes in the past, Canada has been quite problematic, but not now. Canada's really quite helpful in these agreements. But Brazil right now really likes to throw a spanner in the works on the convention. So we end up with a lot of bracketed text because of Brazil. And so all these different agreements, they're kind of, they vary in culture, for lack of a better word. So like the Climate Convention and the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands and CITES, they're pretty top down. So they kind of make agreements and they're fairly imposing on national governments. So they sort of say, this is what you're going to do, and we're going to hold you to it. The CBD, which is the Biodiversity Convention, is way more sort of granola, like let's all be friends. And so it's much more bottom up and volunteer based. And that's one of the biggest problems that we've faced in the last decade or more with this convention, is there's not a lot of teeth to it. And there could be, but it's just the way it's been. And so, for instance, the Climate Convention has something called nationally determined contributions, where countries are asked to say how many megatons of CO2 they're going to cut from their annual emissions. And they try and hold those countries to those commitments. And in fact, we have a ratcheting mechanism where every 2 years, countries are supposed to come back with even more ambitious NDCs, or naturally determined contributions. But the CBD has voluntary national commitments. So we're like, we'll be really thrilled if you maybe make a commitment about something. So it's really just a cultural thing as far as I can understand. Anyways, and the other thing is that these conventions cover lots of different topics, not just targets and goals for the future, but things like how we're going to manage Indigenous knowledge, how we're going to uphold landholder rights for Indigenous communities and their rights around biological resources, and how do we protect them from things like companies going in and digitally sequencing the genomes of certain species. So all that stuff kind of comes into the agreement. And that picture is actually, that's in Montreal. So that's kind of what it's like. And it's really slow and laborious process. Let's put it that way. That's the nice way of putting it. And so then there's Conference of the Parties. So you probably remember that there was COP26 in Glasgow. That was the 26th Conference of the Parties for the Climate Convention. The Climate Convention meets every year. The CBD meets every 2 years. And as mentioned, between COPs, we have all these scientific, technical, and process meetings. And then we also strike short-lived working groups. So I've been on the ad hoc technical expert group on indicators, but then there's also for the negotiation of the current post-2020 global biodiversity framework, we have what we call an open-ended working group, and Canada and Uganda are the co-chairs of this. So this person here, his name is Basil Van Have. He's with Environment and Climate Change Canada. I know him really well. He used to be my boss, actually. And he is the co-chair to shepherd the process through. And this is this fellow here, his name is Francis Ogwell from Uganda. I also work a lot with him because I do a lot of work in Uganda. And so the two of them are in charge of sort of keeping the process through between the ditches and getting a negotiated agreement out. And so the thing that's also interesting, or sometimes frustrating, is that the climate convention gets all the attention. So we had COP26, we had people out in the streets, demonstrating, pushing the countries as hard as they could to make ambitious agreements for the climate. And then this is a screenshot from an article that came out, I think this was in the New York Times. The most important global meeting you've probably never heard of is now. And so that was COP15. So COP15 was the 15th Conference of the Parties for the Biodiversity Convention. And because of the pandemic, it was supposed to happen in October of 2020. But what they did was they had half of the meeting in China last October, and they're going to have the second half of that. Well, we don't know, but probably late summer. But it gets way less attention. Biodiversity just doesn't get the same attention as climate change, obviously. Okay, so now I'll just talk about, and hopefully this isn't too boring, but I'll talk a little bit about the last decade. So we just concluded a 10-year agreement, a global agreement called the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity. And that was set in Japan. And that's why we have, so the host country for those COPs tends to get to name the agreement. So we came up with the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets. And these targets covered everything from improving the state of biodiversity and ecosystems, reducing drivers, indirect and direct drivers, so things like pollution and forest loss on biodiversity, improving the public's understanding of biodiversity and the value of biodiversity, and then also sort of focus targets on financial mechanisms. But the thing is, we failed to reach all of those targets, all 20 of the targets. We didn't reach a single one. We made progress on some, like target 11, which was on protected areas. There was an agreement to protect 17% on average of land areas. And for the most part, we met that globally, but we didn't meet all aspects of the target. And a lot of protected areas around the world are really on paper only. They're not well protected at all. And so every 5 years, there's a report called the Global Biodiversity Outlook that's produced, and I contributed to the last one. So it's like a big global assessment where you bring in various scientists to sort of argue about whether we met these targets or not. And so the sad news is that we didn't meet any of them. And so, of course, then the question is, well, why? So we spent a lot of time, my team at NatureServe and colleagues around the world, sort of doing analysis of the reasons for why we failed in the last 10 years. And that's of course, really important to know if we want to do better going forward. So one of them is lack of mainstreaming. So that's just a fancy word we use for mainstreaming. Is when you try and well, in the case of biodiversity mainstreaming is when you try and get sectors outside of the environment ministry to care about the issue. So what we try and do is mainstream biodiversity across the forestry and agricultural sectors in other countries. So I spent a lot of time doing this in partnership with some countries in Africa and South America and Asia. But there hasn't been much focus on that. But there has been more lately. We're starting to get better on learning how to do that. Mexico has been really great at this, so they've been really leading the way. The other one is limited conservation finance. So we're not spending enough money to help countries conserve ecosystems and species. And at the same time, the trillions of dollars that are spent annually on harmful subsidies like supporting oil and gas, some harmful agricultural techniques massively outweigh conservation finance. And then there's the other issue, and anything with the star are things that I focus my time on, is lack of national capacity. So I spend a lot of time working with countries to try and help build capacity so that they're better equipped to actually meet their targets and goals. And in the last 10 years, there was very little focus on that. They set the goals and targets, and then they kind of just walked away and said good luck. And also what happened with that last agreement is that there was targets on drivers of biodiversity loss, but they were pretty weak, or like they weren't very ambitious, or they were just kind of incoherent. So nobody even really understood what the target meant. And I'll give you an example in a minute. And here it is. So the issue is, and this is a problem with multilateral processes, is when you have 196 countries in a room, it only takes one country to dig in their heels and say, I don't like that word. And it's literally, you can spend a whole night arguing about a word, and you start to think, well, what's the point of this? But the word actually really matters, because the word has legal ramifications and how these agreements are adopted and implemented. And what happens invariably is at the last minute, you have to come up with a compromise. And in the case of the Aichi biodiversity targets, we ended up with these crazy target language that nobody, after they walked out of the room at 6 in the morning, that once they woke up the next day, they were like, what does that even mean? Like, what did I just agree to? And so when countries are then supposed to take that goal and target and make it meaningful at their scale, they have no idea how to do it. And the same goes for data and indicators. So in the last 10 years, we did a really lousy job on bringing together the right methodologies to actually be able to track whether we're moving towards or away from a target and actually guide progress towards that target. And so I guess the one question that I bring up, when you think about this, like I focus a lot of my time on some of these issues, kind of ignoring the fact that we have this massive global explosion in human population and consumption. And we'll talk about this maybe at the end, but can we actually build and implement a perfect plan, or can we finesse our way out of a planet with 10 billion people that are consuming too much stuff? I think we know what the answer is to that, but I put it out there for us to talk about at the end. And so this is just some of the papers that we published lately on this. So I spent a lot of time looking at how countries use indicators and biodiversity data to track targets. But I also worked with some colleagues in China where we looked at the whole last 10 years to try and figure out like what went wrong and how do we actually improve on the process going forward. So, okay, so I'll just talk quickly about the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So this again was supposed to be adopted in 2020, but because of the pandemic, it kept getting put off. But in some ways that was a good thing because it gave us more time to maybe get some of these things right. And I will say that this new agreement is much, much better than the last one. It's more organized. It's the proposed goals and targets are clearer, and the use of indicators and data is much more rigorous. So there's some definite improvements on it, but as that Globe and Mail article focused on, there's still a lot of things that could be improved. And so this is what they call the theory of change. So this is how they've sort of structured this new post-2020 agreement. So the main thing to note is that it's not a 10-year agreement. It's an agreement that's supposed to take us to 2050. So when this convention was brought to force in 1993, it had a 2050 vision for humanity to live in harmony with nature. Now, of course, how do you define that? Scientifically, that's pretty loose. But anyways, in some ways that was good because you have to have some broad scale vision. But of course, we could debate what living in harmony really looks like. Now, what we're trying to do is literally bend the curve of biodiversity loss. So in the next 10 years, the agreement is focused on reducing threats and meeting people's needs and stopping the bleed. So it's about putting what they call it, putting nature on the road to recovery. So it's not about getting to living in harmony with nature, but it's starting to slow down the decline and actually getting us to a point in 2030 that we can actually start to restore ecosystems and start to bend the curve upwards. And so we have 2030 and 2040 and 2050 milestones. And a lot of the focus this time is on really national implementation. How do we equip countries with the tools and the finances they need to actually implement this process? I think I just said all that. But right now, I guess I'll point this out. The current draft of the agreement, and it's public, you can go on the CBD website and look at it. Right now, we have 4 proposed long-term goals. So these are 2050 goals and 21 milestone targets that take us to 2030. So the idea is to like think 30 years out, have some big goals, and then have a very sequenced path to get to 2050. And so we have targets that are focused on 2030. And the goals are outcome oriented. So it's like, what do you want the world to look like? Well, we want to have enhanced integrity of all ecosystems. Well, okay, then what's the target? What's the action-oriented target? Well, 30 by 30. So 30% protected area coverage by 2030 is one way we'll start to improve on ecosystem integrity. And you might have heard of 30 by 30. So that's now been signed by 70 countries around the world that are committed to that. So 30% by 2030, Canada's signed on to that. And again, all these global agreements are translated into national action plans and targets. And that's really important because you can't actually get anywhere globally without national action. That's where the game is. That's where the decisions that make or break biodiversity occur on a daily basis. And so I won't spend too much time on this, but this is just kind of what we call the draft monitoring framework. So this has all the 4 goals and the 21 targets in there. And then we break down each target into its monitoring element, and then we propose indicators for it. So we're trying to come out of China in October, or well, not October, sometime later this year, with an agreement that says these are our goals, these are our targets, these are the quantifiable elements of those targets that we can measure. And here's the indicators that we've agreed to that every country in the world is going to use to track progress. And the point to that is that we're trying to improve transparency. We need to be able to tell if Canada's actually just making things up as it goes along, or is it actually meeting its target? And the only way to do that is to have really rigorous rules around indicators and the use of data. And that's a whole other talk to talk about all the targets and goals. But I'll just give you an example of a target. So right now, target 2 is by 2030, protect and conserve through well-connected and effective system of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, at least 30% of the planet, yada, yada, yada. And so, and the monitoring element will be trends and extent of protected areas. That's a really easy one for us to measure. And we have a number of indicators on task. And so that target's pretty easy. That's an easy one to actually measure and quantify. And we have some other targets that are around equitable participation and decision-making. So it's all about making sure that Indigenous peoples and local communities, what we call IPLCs, and women and girls. So there's a real strong focus on gender equity in these agreements, and youth have a voice at the table on how we actually get there. And so we actually have targets around these particular issues. And then just cherry picking another one around reducing or reforming harmful subsidies. So as mentioned, there's a lot of subsidies out there, but that governments use to prop up certain industries. And we're trying to unravel those. And we have a number of ways that we can actually measure that. And again, you have to have a really rigorous process here, or else countries are going to find loopholes out of this. So that's what we're trying to get at this time around. So we're trying to come up with a much stronger agreement. Okay, so now I'll talk a little bit about what I think is important that we do this time. And some of this was covered in that Globe and Mail article. And this is the big challenge. So, you know, you've heard the term think global, but act local. But it's actually true. So we have these agreements where we're trying to address a global crisis, the sixth extinction crisis. So we have to set global targets. But then if you just stop there, it's the tragedy of the commons. Everyone would look at each other and go, well, who's doing this? Oh, okay, well, it's not me. So that's why you got to scale it down to national. But that's really super, super challenging. So how do you have a target 2 around protected areas that makes sense for Canada and Brazil and Singapore and Belgium? Canada, it makes sense because we can protect intact wilderness areas, same with Brazil. Belgium doesn't have any intact wilderness left. So does that target mean anything to them? So we have to find ways for Belgium to find meaning in that target so that they can actually take action to manage and better manage their living landscapes. So here's my short list of things that I would like to see, and this comes from the failings in the last 10 years. I think global goals and targets need to be SMART. So you probably heard of SMART: specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. So we need to be really careful about how we actually word a target. And I put ACHI target 10 in here because this is an example of it. So if I was your English teacher, I would say, don't word a target like this. This is not a good way. And so ACHI target 10 was a classic one that was agreed to like at 3 in the morning on the last day of the meetings. By 2015, the multiple anthropogenic pressures on coral reefs and other vulnerable ecosystems impacted by climate change or ocean acidification are minimized so as to maintain their integrity and functioning. So if you're a country and you don't have coral reefs, or you're not even sure what a vulnerable ecosystem is, you just kind of just move on. Like it's kind of a meaningless target. And this one was because nobody could agree on a specific climate change target. So this is kind of how it happens. We have to be really careful on having clear and measurable language on our targets. We also have to think about areas of the planet that are beyond national jurisdiction. So a huge chunk of our planet is really under no specific single country's authority. So two-thirds of our oceans are outside of national jurisdiction. And we need to actually have these agreements have some teeth through things like the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas. So we need a way or a mechanism by which these biodiversity targets can be enforced on the high seas, for instance. The other issue is that we need to think about how we scale targets so that they actually can help address drivers that operate at scales beyond the scale of a country. So things like climate change. Climate change is operating at a global scale. And if you own a patch of the Arctic, there's no way that you have the power or ability to address that issue alone. You have to do it in a coordinated fashion around the world, which leads me into this one. This is becoming better understood, but all these different environmental crises, they're all coming from the same core issues, and they're all codependent. So we cannot meet a single one of our biodiversity targets if we let the world warm to 2 degrees or more by 2100. We're totally wasting our time. We can't do it. There's nothing you can do. But the same goes for the climate targets. You cannot hold the world to 1.5 degrees Celsius without massive protection of ecosystems and massive restoration of ecosystems, or what we call nature-based solutions to climate change. So about 37% of what we need to do to keep our world to close to 1.5 degrees has to come from bold action on biodiversity, and vice versa. So these conventions and these efforts are really codependent. You can't do one without the other. And we need to think about that when we establish these agreements. And this is just a concept called the planetary boundaries. So there's 9 of them. And this is a way that we're starting to be able to measure where we're way out of the safe zone. So if you're inside this inner circle, you're safe. If you're starting to go out, your risk goes up, and things like maximum sustained yield, you're way off the map. So things like fisheries, we're way out on, we're in a high risk issue. And so these planetary boundaries are just another way to look at the living system and how we actually manage all these environmental crises in a more constructive or cohesive way. So we have to have bold action on how we use land, and how land cover changes on maximum sustained yield, climate change, ozone depletion, ocean acidification, on and on it goes. And N is nitrogen. So if you're wondering, then P is phosphorus. So around the world, we put way too much nitrogen into the environment. I think about 2/3 of the nitrogen in your body comes from an industrial process that actually fixes nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So we pull nitrogen in the atmosphere to produce food, which then ends up in the environment. Okay, and then just going on, and I hope this is coherent. So global goals and targets also need to account for what we call common but differentiated responsibilities. You might have heard this if you're following the climate convention in Glasgow, so COP26. The developing countries quite fairly said to Europe and Canada and the US, hey, you guys have been dumping carbon in the atmosphere for like 200 years. You developed your economies, and now you're saying, let's turn off the tap. That's not fair. So we need to have common but differentiated responsibilities. The same argument is happening with the biodiversity agreement. So in a number of different ways. So Brazil is saying, we think the baseline year by which we measure biodiversity loss should be like 200 years ago. And by doing that, it shows that North America wiped out most of its biodiversity. We did it in the 1800s. We took out the bison, we transformed our landscapes, and then it sort of makes a fairer baseline than say 2020. But Brazil's doing that because they want to be able to do what we did, which is basically liquefy their natural capital and then come to the table. So it's not, they're not doing this with good intentions. They're doing this as a way that they can continue to deforest the Amazon. But the other issue is that it is on the impacts of trade on biodiversity loss. So Canada could easily meet all of our targets, but we would still continue to be a massive destroyer of nature around the world, just by nature of the things that we import and consume. So we like to think that Canada is a really clean and environmentally conscious country. And yeah, in some ways it is, but you can't have your cake and eat it too. So we have really high consumptive lifestyles, and that's largely held up by developing countries. And that's where the damage is being done. And so this is really critical in these agreements, but of course, developed countries don't really want to talk about this. And so this is one of the friction points right now in the agreement, is between the developing and the developed world, is around issues like impacts of trade. And then I guess the other thing is just that we need to think about the fact that a little bit like climate change and sea level rise, like if we stopped tomorrow putting a single additional molecule of CO2 in the atmosphere, our sea levels are still going to go up because we baked in a lot of that change. The same goes with biodiversity. A lot of dimensions of biodiversity are slow to respond to a driver. And we call that things like extinction debt. So there's probably species out there that we're seeing and that still persist on the landscape, but they're doomed. There's the damage is done. It just is going to take a while before they actually go extinct. And so this is another reason why we need to run out of the gates really quickly with really bold action on biodiversity, because the sooner we stop the damage, we'll see benefits down the road. But even if we stop the damage tomorrow, we're going to still see some declines. And sorry to be kind of a negative on that. And then the other thing is just that these targets need to really promote sustainable practices. So about 40% of the planet's land area is under some sort of extractive process, whether it's agriculture or forestry or things like that. And so you can't get there just with protected areas. We need to manage working landscapes more carefully and in a more smart way. We need to deal with food waste and waste energy and all that sort of stuff. So we need targets that really address that. And currently the draft agreement doesn't, it has targets on this, but they're arguably not strong enough. And then finally, and sorry for going on so long here, but is that it's even more complicated than that. You can't sort of take one target and action it and then go to the next one. We need to think about living landscapes where we're addressing multiple drivers of biodiversity loss at the same time. And that was a big crux of that Globe and Mail article, is we need to come up with ways that Canada, for instance, can really manage issues around climate adaptation and mitigation, invasive species, land cover change, freshwater use in a more coherent and coordinated way. So we need to think about large scale units of land, and that we actually apply those goals and targets across those large areas, and also we mainstream them into those sectors. So what happens typically with these agreements is that it's people like me, a well-meaning biologist that goes to these meetings, and then someone is an environment minister that signs the agreement, and then the environment minister goes home and doesn't tell any of her colleagues in the other ministries about this agreement. And so the forestry minister, the agriculture minister, they're just not really aware of this agreement. And of course, they're way more important than the environment ministry, if you ask me. They're the ones that actually need to take action to stop the decline. And then, and this is maybe my final one. We also, as I've already pointed this out, but we need better ways to actually track target progress with reliable and credible data. So most of what we measure when it comes to biodiversity in the world are vertebrates, like birds and mammals and things like that. But that's not actually what the world's biodiversity is made up. It's mostly made up of invertebrates. We don't really understand them at all. And that's based on, taxonomic bias and what we're interested in, what we can see, but also spatially around the world. The best observations are found in Europe and North America, not surprisingly, but we got to fill those gaps in the mega diverse parts of the planet. And I keep saying finally, and then there's one more. This, I think, is my final. So this is also, I think, this is where I spend my time. So I focus a lot of my time in different parts of South America and Africa and Southeast Asia, but I also work up in the Arctic still. And we try and share and build a community where we can share best practices, lessons learned. I work a lot with the space agencies to bring better land cover data products to countries, technology and financing. So how do we equip countries so they can actually do a better job? And this little graphic is a tool that we built called Biodiversity Observation Network in a Box, or Bond in the Box, that does stuff like that. Oh man, I keep saying finally, and there's another one. It will end. The other one is just around connecting people to nature. We need to make the case that it's not just for people that love nature for aesthetic reasons, but that reminding people that you actually fully and completely are dependent on nature. And so we call that nature's contributions to people. And so we're trying to strengthen targets in the agreement that secure things like fresh water supply, biomass for people to consume, and so on and so forth. So really couple human needs with biodiversity. Okay, now I'm done, but I thought I would end here. I don't know if we have time and of course you guys can say whatever you want or ask questions or whatever, but I thought maybe it would be useful to pose a couple questions. So when you think about these global agreements, and here they are negotiating all these different goals and targets, like, can that or should that have meaning at the local scale, like for Kings County? Like, for instance, what does the 30 by 30 protected area target mean for us? I already mentioned this, but can we finesse our way out of this? Like, can we actually build the perfect plan and implement the perfect plan without addressing fundamental drivers? I don't think so. But I'm hoping someone can tell me I'm wrong. And then the final one, I guess, is just, are these agreements useful? So I always think of like Winston Churchill. I think he said something like, democracy is the worst form of government except for all others. And I think about that sometimes with these global agreements. Like, they're painful, they're frustrating, there's not a lot of progress. But then I ask myself, what if we didn't have a multilateral process? Where would we be then? The only reason we got to 17% protected area coverage is because we had a global agreement. Anyways, I'll stop talking there and just leave those as food for thought. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was both inspiring and depressing, I think I could say. Maybe, Mike, maybe if you maybe don't share your screen anymore so that we can see more people, and it might be easier to ask questions. Yeah, good. I, as usual, have lots of questions, but does anybody have a question for Mike? Actually, Mike, I might just mention that we had a webinar a couple of weeks ago where Alain Beliveau gave his proposal for what could be done in Kings County, but I don't think he was going for 30%. What was?
Yeah, I was on. I was in that webinar.
You were in that. Okay, good. Yeah. So, and I think that's kind of a is a local approach that needs to be taken everywhere. But anyways. Does anybody have a question for Mike? And if you do have a question, you can either maybe put it in the chat. Well,
I don't have a question per se, but I have a comment. So maybe that can be a place to start.
Yes.
I think, thank you for this talk, first of all, Mike. As someone who studied politics and is always keen on this, like, I kind of love learning about the process, and I think it's important to sort of understand how things are actually operating at these global conventions that impact so much of us. But I really liked what you said about the climate convention and the biodiversity convention, or like the agreements as cannot operate as mutually exclusive. And yet, in my experience of like climate activism and stuff, like, sure, biodiversity is tossed around, but there's not a real concerted, like, we need protected areas and these targets for biodiversity loss in that discussion. So I think that's a really powerful point that you made there, that you illustrated. So I just wanted to make that comment. And as for your questions posed about, can we operate without global conventions? Like, I don't really know what the answer is, but I like to think sometimes that the Westphalian state system that we exist in, where states have borders and this notion of state sovereignty within those borders, is really only less than 400 years old. And so I try to remind myself that there have been other ways of thinking, or there could be other ways of thinking beyond the boundedness of states, and that the persistency of global conventions, even with their failings, is really important to challenge that notion of boundedness within states. So I don't know. I don't really have an answer. I just wanted to make those 2 points, and that I appreciated that talk.
No, yeah, thanks for that, Carolyn. Well, this, I guess, in reaction to that, yeah, I wonder sometimes if it's fundamentally flawed, and for all sorts of reasons, maybe the way we've carved up the earth and all that. And so we're trying to sort of organize ourselves out of a wet paper bag and we can't do it. On the other hand, I have no power, of course, to change the whole political dynamic of the planet. So we try and work with what we've got. But it is a good point that I think we need to get out of being stuck in the same old patterns and processes, because they're probably not lending themselves well to what we need to do.
Thanks. Anybody else? If not, then I will ask a question. Just two, maybe two comments maybe. I think, like you mentioned, that people demonstrated in the streets when it's for climate change, but not for species loss. And I just think, I think that people are beginning to feel climate change. Like it's a lot of people, if we don't feel it, we see it in the news with flooding and forest fires and extreme heat, et cetera, et cetera. So it's become apparent. But I think with biodiversity loss, with the loss of species, we don't see it. So it's not, and I think people, like we see clear cuts, we hear about, clear cutting of the tropical rainforests, but somehow I don't know that we can equate loss of tropical rainforest or forest here in Nova Scotia with species loss. So I'm not sure that it is obvious to a lot of people. Now, the other thing I was going to bring up was, I think it's commendable that these agreements have to be by consensus and all countries have to agree. But I wonder if there has ever been any discussion about, like, if you're in a group and of 100 people and suddenly 90 of them walk in one direction, the chance is that the other 10 people are going to follow, even if they didn't quite agree with that direction. So I just wonder if during these conventions, that if you ignored a country that did not want to sign a particular wording, if they were just said, okay, you're off then, and then by feeling kind of ashamed later on, they would actually follow, or is that a total no-no?
Yeah, well, on your last point or question first,
Yeah,
it definitely does seem to be, it's sort of like the way the UN was established and formulated. So it's kind of almost like a golden rule to focus on the consensus. But I hear you, it's highly problematic, and we saw that with actually the COP26, the Glasgow meetings. It was at the last minute that actually, and it was Brazil, threw in some demands that really, they were almost at an agreement to come in out of that meeting, and then Brazil waited at the last minute to throw the spanner in the works. And so I do agree, there's got to be a ways to prevent that bad faith negotiation, or sideline it. There isn't a mechanism to do that right now. And I think you're spot on when it comes to the difference between climate change and biodiversity. I think we've done a good job at having people see their own self-interest being at risk with climate change.
right.
I don't think they were there yet with biodiversity. We don't take it that seriously because we haven't really felt it or seen it in the same way, at least some of us. But
right. I see there's a question or a comment in the chat there, and that is from Patricia Seeley, and it's Kings County is only at 4% protection. Alain's proposal was to get to 20%. Seemed ambitious, but at least doable. I like that he focused on wildlife corridors. Who will get us to 20 and then 30? And then question about council. I guess, so this, so Alain's talk was to get to 20% by 2030. So what is the 30-30 convention? Has that been signed, or is it?
No, so that's an initiative. So 30 by 30 is a global initiative
It's
for
an initiative,
countries to
right.
sign on, but that right now the proposed percentage target in the global agreement is 30%.
Right, okay,
That's at the national scale. So I think we have to be careful on how we translate. It's like a scale issue. Like if you
right,
translate it to Kings County, which is has a lot of agriculture, people are going to go, these folks are clearly out to lunch. Like that's not realistic. And
yeah.
so we could do 30% for Nova Scotia. It might
But
be hard to do that for Kings
for
County.
Kings County, yeah,
And maybe what's more important is that we think about how do we, because I mean, food production, we all totally dependent on it. We shouldn't see it as a bad thing, but can we find ways to accommodate nature into that and maintain pollinators on the landscape and stuff like that?
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. Before I ask another question, does anybody have, I see Scott Burbidge, your microphone is on. Does that mean you have a question?
I do, if there's time.
Yes, absolutely.
Very briefly, thanks for a fabulous but absolutely overpowering presentation. But in terms of the nation state is an anachronism in terms of the challenges we face. But given that, what do you think of the Arctic Council, which Lloyd Axworthy was active in creating as a potential model for addressing climate change and biodiversity and a whole range of other challenges in a geographic region with a unique structure, unique climate and geography and so on?
Yeah, well, I've worked a lot with the Arctic Council. In fact, I still do. So I work with their biodiversity working group, and I'm a big fan of it, because I think, as you're alluding to, it operates at the right scale. So it's a regional political body, and what they have in common is the Arctic, is high latitude systems, and so they can wrap their head around that. They can agree to things. The same with, to some extent, some other regional political organizations. It's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, although that's pretty weak. But I think you're right. Like, I think the Arctic Council has done a great job in some ways, although it still suffers from the fact that it has to find agreement. And sometimes that can be very difficult. And we've seen that both from, in particular, from the US as well as Russia in certain instances with the Arctic Council, that they have to find ways around disagreements that maybe end up being not great for anybody. But having said that, I do think the Arctic Council model's a good one, and maybe we need to think about stronger regional groupings around common interests, like for different issues around biodiversity.
Thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else?
There's a question in the
Oh,
chat.
there is one, yes. I think it's a comment really, but I'll read it. I think that they're at the thought process of trying to protect 20% of land within Kings County is very useful to get citizens to think about these goals. It brings the discussion closer to smaller communities. Of course, 30% in Nova Scotia shouldn't be a problem at all, but everyone will start looking at someone else unless you have a tool to discuss the issue, and doing it county by county could be a great tool. Yes, I think, yeah, good comment. One of my problems with setting aside, like, say, even the 30% protected areas, that for many countries, and certainly Canada, it's easy to take areas where we derive no economic benefit and say, okay, we'll protect these areas, mountaintops, and then we can continue as, you know, the status quo and the rest of the landscape. And really, the places where we have lost the greatest biodiversity, of course, is in all our agricultural fields right across North America. And I think Brazil was fine that if you go back 200 years, that's when in the US and Canada, we lost all kinds of species when the prairie and other and eastern deciduous forests were converted to farmland. So I totally understand the notion that, wait a minute, you know, developed countries, they lost all their biodiversity, all their species a long time ago. And now that other countries are beginning to, I'll use the term destruction of their landscape, they're facing that. So it is really a conundrum like that we're dealing with. But I think what needs to be done, and I think what, you know, the Blomida Naturalists stand for, is really to get more people to appreciate nature and to understand that just because you can't see a species or some, you know, organism doesn't mean that it's not important, it doesn't need protection. And you're so right, Mike, you were talking about it's usually vertebrates. Well, we could probably, I'll go out on the limb, we could probably lose all vertebrates and still have very functioning ecosystems, because it really is the insects and the invertebrates that drives the whole system. And they're the ones that are being lost when we, you know, turn land into agricultural fields and whatever else. But it's a huge challenge that we're facing, and I really think that, yeah, we need some mechanism so that people can really begin to feel what is going on. Google Earth, just yesterday, for whatever reason it was, I used Google Earth and I flew over the Canadian prairies, which is kind of a fun thing to do. And I did it at about 2-kilometer elevation. And it's nothing but square blocks of fields that are either in some crop or being harvested or lying fallow, and it's just open dirt. And it is absolutely phenomenal when you cruise over the globe and look at the impact of humans in forested ecosystems, in the prairies, right around the world. It is amazing how we have been able to, you know, transform this globe into a human-dominated landscape. Anyways,
Well said.
we mustn't give up.
Well said. Well, and if you really want to be aware of and we're all aware of the pace of forestry, even in Kings County, if you go into the Global Forest Change website, you can run a time series animation of the Landsat data for just up on the South Mountain there, and you'll be very shocked at how stable that forest cover was until about 12 years ago, when you'll see it just get wiped out.
Yes.
And we're not fully aware of that, but that it's hard to ignore that when you see a time series animation from space.
Right.
Anyways.
Okay, I see there's a question here. Here's a question from Alison Scott Butler. Is it possible to move towards regenerative agriculture, such an element of protected areas and biodiversity be part of every agricultural system? I think we have to move in that direction, because it's only like, we cannot set 30% of the globe aside and say, okay, we won't touch it, and then we totally devastate the rest of it. And because doing that, we're equally doomed. Coming back to E.O. Wilson, E.O. Wilson has estimated and stated that we need to protect 50% of the landscape, not 20, not 30, 50% of it. And I think we need a new thinking. We need to, like you said, understand that we humans are part of nature, and we have to live in, you know, we have to live with nature. And I think it's possible, but it's just our current, I'll say, capitalistic system is not the best one at all for achieving that. Anyways, is there one last question, or shall we?
There's a question in the chat earlier from Catherine. I think the chat kind of gets juggled around.
Oh, okay. Can you read it? Maybe I can't. Which?
I can read it if you like. And I actually had I was going to connect some of the conversation.
Okay.
So the question is, well, comment, I'm extremely impressed with this presentation and with the depth of knowledge and experience that the presenter brings. I agree. Perhaps we need to form a small group to translate the biodiversity goals and priorities into a concrete set of targets for local action and advocacy. And what I was going to make a comment on that was, you know, perhaps some of the work around regenerative agriculture would be a good place to start here locally, kind of combining this vision for biodiversity protection with what our landscape looks like around us, which, as we've noted, is a lot of agricultural fields. And so that was just going to be my comment, kind of bringing in some of the elements of the conversation together. Yeah. But if anyone else wants to jump in on that question, I think it's
I think it's brilliant, because that is the whole intention of these global agreements, is that people find relevance to them and they're motivated to take action at their scale. So I think that's a success to me, for the population in this area, and led by Blomidon Natural Society, to promote that. And obviously we're not going to see like 100% success rate, but even if there was some, then we're moving in the right direction. Yeah.
And I think we have an opportunity it's already been started in a sense because of the Wolfville Farmers Market, because there are a number of young farmers there that really are practicing regenerative agriculture, and they are making a living doing it because of the Wolfville Farmers Market. And I think that shows that it can be done. And yes, and I think you will find that the BNS, we are moving in that direction to work more with the local farmers and the Wolfville Farmers Market. So thanks. Good. Thanks, Caroline, for seeing that question and a comment there, or a question, because I had missed that. Anyway, Mike, I want to thank you very much for giving, again, a very exciting talk. And I think this is very relevant. And I think you were saying, I hope I can make it interesting. And this kind of topic is one that I think, you know, somehow it'd be easier not to listen to it, because then we don't have to face that reality. But we really do have to listen to this. And I think you did an excellent job at presenting this topic and stirring up interest. And I really strongly feel that the BNS, I will certainly make an attempt to move us in that direction, where we are looking at what can we do locally. So thanks again for a wonderful presentation, and thanks everybody for taking part and listening, asking questions. And this is indeed something that we all have to do something about. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, good.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. And don't forget the Canning Coffee House, everybody. It's a wonderful place.
Yeah, thanks for the plug, Soren.
Good. Okay. See you in March, everybody. Thanks.